Good evening, and welcome. I'm John Finn, Director of Lewis and Clark Library and Secretary to the Library Foundation. The Lewis and Clark Library Foundation, a 501c3 corporation, works to enhance the quality of public library services to our community by encouraging and generating philanthropic gifts and bequests with accountability to donors and to the public. Our vision is that each member of our community will have superior access to the highest quality library and information services now and into the future. The Foundation strives to enhance services and programs at Lewis and Clark Library by sponsoring several community events each year. After a one-year hiatus, the annual Stephen Ambrose Memorial Lecture is back tonight, featuring Helena author Scott G. Hibbard in conversation with journalist Clay Scott. I'm happy you could join us this evening, if only virtually. Scott G. Hibbard is a fourth-generation Montanan, where his family has owned and operated a cattle and sheep ranch for over 100 years. Scott attended public school in Helena and received a BA in English Literature from Williams College and 2 graduate degrees, an MFA in Creative Writing and an MBA from the University of Montana. Scott worked for the family ranch for a number of years, and while continuing his involvement with the ranch, he started and operated a ranch management enterprise that provided management and consulting services to other ranches. He lives near Helena. Joining Scott in conversation this evening is Clay Scott. Clay is a longtime journalist who has worked in radio, print, and television. He spent many years as a foreign correspondent based in Sarajevo, Jerusalem, Moscow, and London, covering wars and conflicts in the Middle East, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Africa. Clay has won many awards for his work, including an Emmy while with ABC News for his reporting in Kosovo. He currently produces audio stories as well as working with homeless and disadvantaged teens around Montana. He lives in Helena. Scott's book, Beyond the Rio Gila, follows the U.S. Army and a Mormon battalion with families in tow on an 1840s perilous trek across the American Southwest. Part adventure, part coming of age, part military history, this literary historical novel is a rousing human story with a cast of engaging characters. An alcoholic Eastern intellectual, a young man running to and from love, pregnant Mormon women fleeing religious persecution, stoic Army officers, each with distinctive stories and voices, share humor, hardship, and intrepid perseverance. Due to the nature of tonight's presentation, we will not have a Q&A period. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. Clay and Scott, the floor is yours.
John, and thank you, John, and thank you, Scott, for inviting me to visit with you tonight about your fantastic book. A couple of years before it was published, you emailed me a draft to read and comment on, and I think I spent about $50 of my hard-earned money at Allegra to print it out so I wouldn't have to read it on my laptop. And it was $50 well spent because I was blown away by how good it was. And I recently reread it in hardback, and it's just as good as I remember it. Really impressive work. And I was telling a friend about it yesterday and describing why I liked it so much and trying to describe the book. And I felt that I didn't really do it justice in my attempt to describe it to my friend. So would you be kind enough to kind of run us through the book and talk briefly about what it's about?
It's a historical novel. The historical backbone of it has to do with the recruitment and march of the Mormon battalion in the Mexican-American War. 500 Mormons were recruited. They were in the process of migrating. They had left Nauvoo, been chased out of Nauvoo, Illinois.
In Illinois, across the river.
Illinois.
Yeah.
They were camped on near the Missouri River, Council Bluffs, that general area, Council Bluffs, one of the camps was there. And the U.S. Army at the time was engaged or becoming engaged in this 1846 in the Mexican-American War. And there was some thought that, well, we need troops in the Southwest to bolster what forces we have there. The idea came up, is actually sold, I believe, to the U.S. government by more or less a non-Mormon who was basically a Mormon emissary. But a guy named Thomas Kane, that was his name, Thomas Kane. But the idea was to recruit those soldiers, those troops there. They were geographically relatively close, and march them down to where they thought they would be needed, which ended up being San Diego. So the book is much about that march from Council Bluffs, Iowa to San Diego. Longest march in U.S. infantry history, about 1,900 miles, through some godforsaken desert country. Little water, sometimes days without water. It's just, frankly, it's amazing they made it. That's part of it. The other part is a parallel journey of U.S. dragoons. Dragoons were the cavalry at the time, precursors to the United States cavalry. So there's interaction between some characters in those two units. The historical background concerns those treks. The story that I came up with to tell that, relay that history, show that history, didn't start out this way. It was what it became, a coming of age story where the protagonist is a young runaway who joins the U.S. Dragoons and gets to know, helps participate in the recruitment of the Mormon battalion in Council Bluffs, and then carries those friendships, what turn out to be friendships throughout the course of the book.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of lots of things I want to ask you. And one is that the history of the American West, including the military history of the West, has been told and retold in countless ways, thousands of times. So how the heck did you come up with this story that is a really important story of American Western history that has been ignored?
Yeah, it's interesting. I basically fell into it. I did not know this history. I was essentially researching another story, which starts in the 1870s, actually in Montana, but couldn't find the beginning of the story. So to do that, I just couldn't get comfortable with it, but I knew I didn't have it right. So to get there, I followed some historical figures, real life historical figures back through history. I keep turning on, as I did so, I kept turning up these references to some earlier historical events, kept turning up. One was the Utah War, which I knew nothing about. So I got into that history. That, by the way, will be the subject of the sequel to this book. Got captivated with that history, started researching and writing about that. But I still couldn't get to the beginning. And I kept coming across these, so I continued research, kept coming across references to the Mormon battalion. Never heard of it, didn't know anything about it. So I started researching that. It was the same thing all over again, deja vu all over again. This history was striking, and not only just how important it was and how phenomenal it was what these people accomplished, but the fact that nobody knew about it, at least outside of LDS circles, or very few did. So this is a story that needs to be told. So that's what got me into that book. And once I got there, I knew I had the beginning, and then it went from there.
So speaking of which, obviously Latter-day Saints individuals and history figure very prominently in this book. So I need to ask you, are you a church member?
No, I'm not. Cradle to grave Episcopalian, frankly, but obviously have friends and some, business associates, I'll say, ran staff over the years who are LDS. And, obviously I'm very comfortable with those people, great people. great people. So I mean, that just wasn't part of it. But I guess the advantage I would say that brings to me is that I can get into this history from a church that is from a viewpoint that is from outside of the LDS Church.
Mhm.
So it brings a different perspective. I like to think one that is might be more rounded, or at least a different perspective.
It still must be challenging, you're writing about a community of which you are not a part. Did you ever, I mean, you're hyper aware of, sensitivities. Have you gotten feedback from LDS people about the book?
A few, yes.
Positive?
Oh, yes, frankly. And one of them was initially when I had a draft of this book done, which changed considerably since then. But I sent the draft. I got fortunate enough to get to know a well-known historian of LDS history, a guy named Will Bagley out of Utah, who's written any number of books about LDS history. He's very good, very readable, very smart.
But mostly
very good
targeted
historian.
or intended for community members.
I don't know that I can say that. He grew up. He is LDS or was LDS, but he's not really approaching that from an inside the church perspective. He's approaching it from the standpoint of he understands the LDS community because he grew up in it. He was active in it for a period of years in his younger life. But anyway, I ran the manuscript by him. Actually hired him to review it, to make sure I had the history right and some of the cultural ideas and things about the religion that I just really wouldn't know. And fortunately, he assured me that I did and corrected a few things that I didn't. So that was a big help. And in addition to that, since the book's come out, some LDS friends have read it. They've been quite satisfied, if not pleased, which of course pleases me.
Good.
Yeah. So it tells me I didn't entirely miss it.
Right.
It's not make believe rendition of what the LDS folks would have been like.
Good. I mean, it just, to my ears and eyes as an outsider, it seems authentic. It rings true.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Why did you approach it as historical fiction?
Well,
because it sounds like you have, even though you got an MFA in creative writing, you have the bent of a historian.
Well, thank you. To me, the history was, fiction was my primary interest. But the history was really, or the fiction became to me a very good way to tell a history. The history, I don't. Writing an historical book, I think would probably bore me. I don't know. I haven't tried that. I can fall into this research and stay there because there's just so much fascinating stuff there. But when it comes to terms of writing it, to write fiction is just such a scholarly, disciplined approach you have to take. Writing fiction is also very disciplined, but you've got more freedom. You've got freedom of imagination. The thing that interests me in the fictional aspect of it is trying to bring life into the people who live those events to the reader in a way that's really difficult to do with history. It's great history. So to me, it's just for my interests and my purposes, fiction was just a more vibrant way to tell a history.
Yeah, I'm glad you treated it as historical fiction because it's great. I mean, I think I don't know how long we've known each other, maybe 15 or 16 years.
Yeah.
And as long as I've known you, it seems I've been aware that there's some literary project underway or in the works. How long from your first, wouldn't call it a thunderbolt of inspiration from the moment when you first decided this is a story that I want to tackle this project, from then to the final draft?
That's a hard question to answer, Clay. When I got serious about writing a book, to start this whole thing it was 20 years ago, and coming up on 21. Yeah, I'll be 21 here real soon. But anyway, it took me quite a while to find this particular story. But a lot of the research I did early on contributed to this story, to bring this history alive. But the actual, I really kind of have to guess how much time I could say is actually devoted to this book. And I'd have to say at least 7 years if I packed it in, at least, maybe longer, considering how long it takes to get it, find a publisher and get it published.
I mean, one can certainly turn out that many pages in a much shorter time, but to anyone who's watching this, who ends up reading the book, you start reading it and you will see how meticulous it is. And, it's clear how much work goes into it. I don't know if you remember this, a few years ago, I ran into you up west of McDonald Pass by your old barn there. I think you were moving cattle or something, and I was going for a drive, and I stopped and we chatted for a couple minutes, and then you said, well, I don't mean to be rude, but I have a schedule to keep. and I thought two things. I thought, one, this is a man who gets things done, and I need to be more like him. But I also thought that was reflective of you. I knew at the time you were writing this book that how disciplined you must have to be, and how much perseverance and discipline to carry out a project like this. And I also thought, the cowboy, like Hollywood cowboys, or sort of the iconic cattlemen of American Western mythology, don't say things like, I've got a schedule to keep. And I thought that was probably also reflective of your vision of the world and your vision of the American West, which, at least the way it's reflected in your book, it's really devoid of cliche. And trust me, I looked for cliches in there, I couldn't find any. So I guess that's not really a question, it's a compliment. But I do have a question about, many questions about your process, because when reading this book, it all seems organic. The description, the characters, the dialogue, there's a nice flow to it. But I realize that you don't just sit down at your keyboard and start typing away, that a lot goes into it, and every writer has a different process for integrating all those different levels. So can you talk a little bit about what yours was, and did it stay constant throughout the process, or did it evolve?
Oh, I'd have to say it evolved. Where to start with that one? Probably get an idea. One of the hardest things to do is sit down with a blank screen in front of you and try to make something of it. You wonder, I know I have a story to tell, but how in the world do I even get started on this thing? And I would usually start with a line of dialogue, and then say, well, what would be a good retort to that, a response? And then I'll have another line of dialogue that's a consequence of the first line, and go on from there and start to develop some sense of a conversation. I have no idea where it's going to go. And then once that starts to go, then some personalities start to come out in those lines of dialogue. So I start looking at those personalities. And then I think what I do, I haven't really quite thought about this, Clay, and I've tried to reconstruct what I've done, and then somehow I weave those into the events of the story I'm trying to tell, to bring fictional characters, sometimes historical figures. You got to be real guarded on what you have them say. That's another issue. But, so I think that's where a lot of it starts.
Mhm.
And then once it gets going, it's like a friend of mine says, pushing a boulder.
Mhm.
You know, once you get it going,
There's momentum.
there's momentum. Once, if you let it stop, then there's inertia that you have to overcome to get it going again. So for me, it was always a start and stop process.
Mhm.
Summer's busy ranch season, spring through, well, into November, sometimes December, just very little would happen. So it's really primarily winter activity for me. But anyway, work through it initially, sketch it out, you know, terrible first draft. Writers often use a different, more descriptive term than that. But you go from there and you rework it, and then pretty soon it starts to get to be a lot of fun because you can see that this is turning into something, and you can play with the language.
Mhm.
You can change dialogue. One of the things about that, I mean, how many times have you been in a conversation with somebody and then gone off, walked away, and said, "Why didn't I say so and so? I wish I would have thought to say that."
Why didn't I have that clever retort?
That's right. Well, when you're writing, you can do that.
Yeah,
You
you're
get to
playing
go
God.
back and change it. So that's
Yeah.
part of what makes it so much fun.
Yeah. And so you sort of anticipated some of my next questions. I love the characters. When you were at the beginning of our conversation, you were describing kind of the outline of the book. But what you can't convey in that description is the depth of the characters, in particular, Cole and Abner. I mean, great characters. Some of my favorite. I think one of my favorite pairings of characters in recent fiction that I've read. I mean, they're really strong and endearing and poignant. And where did those two characters in particular come from? That just popped out of your imagination, or are they modeled on someone?
Basically, both. You know, they're both imaginative.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that's imagined, generally at some level, is based on things we know or people we've known.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can't point my finger specifically who that would be or where in these characters,
Mhm.
but I know it's there.
They might be a composite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Moses, you know, I just started out with, and I don't know how he got into the story or how I came up with a young runaway. I don't recall how that came about. But he just started as, I don't know, I think kind of a minor character, but just once I was actually had to be told this was a coming of age story I was working on. I didn't know that, but that became that's what it became, evolved to be. Then I started focusing more on Moses and fleshing him out more. But a lot of that was really product of imagination. Abner, initially he had a very small role, didn't even have a name.
And explain who Abner and Moses are.
Okay.
Moses is the young runaway.
Moses
from
is the
Virginia.
protagonist, that's correct.
Mhm.
Young runaway from Virginia who is running from some things and
Has
just escaping.
An abusive dad.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right. And had what he was pretty sure was a girlfriend that he wanted to get back to, but he had to get away from a bad family situation. So he just left. He didn't know where he was going. No idea.
Mhm.
Just left, and ended up in the dragoons because he's cold, wet, and hungry, and they could feed him and clothe him and give him a roof over his head and let him ride horses. That was a real appeal to him. So he just kind of drifted for a while until he's kind of got his feet underneath of him. Tell me if I'm not answering your question.
No, you are. Okay, and so that's Moses. I mean, and he connects with Abner.
Abner, who comes in very early, chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
He's an officer, not an officer. He's a private, but he's on guard duty at the Carlisle barracks where the U.S. Dragoons were at the time. And first soldier Abner meets. And initially he did, he was just there for that purpose only, didn't have a name. And then events happened later on in the book that a friend told me that in a writer's group a number of years ago, said this particular event, people would have known each other. So you got to put names, you got to make some of these characters real to the reader. So I said, no, he was right, he was dead right. So that led me to go back to this initial soldier who Moses met and turn him into a real more fuller character. And he just took off on his own. I mean, he could have taken over the book.
I mean, you must have really enjoyed writing his dialogue.
Oh, I really did, yeah.
Would this, not to interrupt you, would this be a good time for you to read that selection that you're sure? Because that illustrates some of your writing as well as these two principal characters.
Yeah. These guys are Moses and Abner. Let's see, one of these. Bear with me. I know I have it marked here. Oh, yeah, it's up here. Okay, this is Moses and Abner, and they just participated actually in a charge on horseback of a Mexican works in New Mexico. And unfortunately, the works were not manned. They'd been abandoned. They didn't know that when they charged it. And Moses's horse had run away with him, so he was in the vanguard and was really in harm's way if anybody would have been there. So this is after that charge. They rode up the gorge and into cedar and pinyon and longleaf pine, a cutaway country with crevices and crags, rifts riven from water runoff, outcrop rock, and boulders cast from a furious earth. Like a shot-up body, Moses thought. Fear snuck up, squeezed out the exhilaration of the charge. That could have been it. No more heartache, no chance to set things right. Abner said, "Mind, my lads, a whaleman would say we resemble a whaler heaved on a heavy sea, uncertain if we are the hunter or the hunted on the unseen deep." His eyes moved through the fractured land. They rode on in the habit of endurance, step by step, like a hand travels a clock. Miles passed. Abner said, "We seek Eden." "Hear that?" Moses said to Donovan, who rode ahead of him. "He's off and gone again, running a trail the bloodhound can't track." Donovan turned. "Disturbing the peace is what he's doing." "California, gentlemen," Abner said, "reputed to be the envy of Eden, perchance a veritable Eden itself." "Throwing them words at pupilless," Moses said. "Hand me the cotton," Donovan said. "Don't need to hear it." It was Socrates I endeavored to emulate and turned to John Barleycorn for tutelage, which, to Moses Cole, it seemed like Abner Black drifted with the dust that moved with the dragoons marching to Apache Canyon. "Gets my attention and leads me to dangle," Donovan said. "Which what?" Moses said. "Which led to a change in occupation," Abner said. A mile passed, the dust hovered. Abner said, "The day came when I reconnoitered my situation and found it lacking. John Barleycorn knows a heart as the gateway to the soul, and he had conquered my heart." "Seen that," Moses said. "I'd become forlorn and broken and well-versed in my shortcomings, resigned to a lack of hope or useful enterprise, which led to a stint with religion, which I relinquished as a refuge of the defeated." "Done that right," Moses said. "Which restored me to John Barleycorn, yet I retained sense enough to join the army before sobriety reclaimed its tenuous grip. Once enlisted, I discovered the army becomes me, wherein I am judged by my ability to do as others command, for which I am eminently qualified." A gust of wind shoved the dust away from the mile-long column of dragoons. John Barleycorn, Moses said, him and Pa was business partners. Which explains your father's inconstant temperament, Abner said. Partly, Moses said. After his mother died, his pa took in anger and nurtured it like he would the runt of the litter. He'd simmer it until it boiled over, like water to scald hogs, fueled with too much wood. Moses figured his brother would have been 10 years old, big enough to pick the chicken eggs, clean the coop, wring the necks of stewing hens. They would have been a family at home in the harmony of farm life. His neglect had changed that, drowned his mother, denied life to the brother who never drew breath, turned his father mean, all from a lapse at a gate latch. He lost what he loved then, family and farm, and later on, the mending Miss Isabella brought to stitch his split heart. Something in him crumbled from events born of his own hand. He pictured paper torn from the Virginia Herald, soiled and dropped in the privy pit. He thought leaving home and the luck of the wayfaring runaway, joining the dragoons and their march to the war with Mexico would settle his unquiet mind, but it merely muffled it. If the Mexican regulars had manned their works, they'd have sent him to hell. That might pay his bail, so to say, but it would not make things right. Abner said, "You've escaped your father's darkness, my young private, and now it's Eden we seek and the prospects that California holds to be its home." "You are a curious fit for a dragoon," Moses said. "Me and him makes two. Both of us here to patch over problems. I got an end in sight, get growed up, go home and stake my place. But Abner, there's something to puzzle over."
John Barleycorn, a folk euphemism for alcohol.
That's right.
That is brilliant. I know people just heard you read. I just want to reread something. They rode up the gorge and into cedar and pinyon and long-leafed pine, a cutaway country with crevices and crags, rifts riven from water runoff, outcropped rock, and boulders cast from a furious earth. That sounds like T.S. Eliot.
Mm.
I mean, yeah, that's really good writing, and you use alliteration throughout. I mean, not in a heavy-handed way, but alliteration and other little, devices and pacing. Even this passage, lapse at a gate latch, lost what he loved then, family and farm, mending Miss Isabella, stitch his split heart, pictured paper, privy pit. Are you? Is that fun for you to do that with language?
Oh yeah, that's a lot of fun, and that's something that I would say I learned from Richard Hugo,
Mm-hmm.
or one of the lessons at least I gathered from him. Whether it was intended or not, is what I picked up. But a lot of it is driven by sound, by ear. The sound of one word can suggest another one. So that's really what's happening there. So to me, when I get into a passage like that, it's more like writing poetry.
Mm-hmm.
But it's got to have the narrative of prose so you can follow it. But if you can do it right, if it's done right, then you have the enhanced, the additional dimension of the beauty of the language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we're conditioned to read with our eyes, but when I was reading this in manuscript, one day I was waiting for water to boil for coffee, and I started reading it aloud, and I thought, wow, this is really good. So yeah, especially passages like that. And I think you have a good, really good sense of pacing, because that can be, you can't read page after page of that kind of description, but picking your spots.
That's right.
Super effective. So we've heard a little bit about Abner and Moses. Talk about the dialogue, because to my ear it rings true, and we don't. especially unlettered people, illiterate, uneducated people, we don't know that much about how they spoke 180 years ago. The Abner character, we have a little better handle on, but there are no podcasts in 1840 to listen to cadence, lexicon, colloquialisms, so I love this dialogue, but is it just a stab in the dark? Do you just say, well, who the hell knows? I'll write it like this, or did you do extensive research to try to narrow down some of the possibilities?
A lot of it, in terms of Moses's dialogue and characters like him, I would have to say that at least the grounding for that for me came from our experience, or my brothers and my experiences of growing up on a ranch in the era that we did, that had the bunkhouse full of single older guys who were all raised on farms, and most of whom would, they were, maybe that's what they love to do. That's what they like to do. They might be running from drinking problem or some other situation, whatever. But some of that manner of speaking comes from that, and then also over the years, just some of the cowboys I've ridden with, some of the real country boy cowboys who just have a wonderful pattern of speech and expression. I haven't seen that so much in recent years, but when we were younger, it was fairly common. So that's part of it. Somewhere along the line, I've had to be influenced by movies I've seen, things in films. So we all have that kind of stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
Some seems real, some doesn't. Mm-hmm. And then just reading some things, you come across some first-person accounts, and it gives you some idea. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a mix of all that. Abner, you're right. You go back and read some of the letters from that area of educated people, and even privates. You find a lot of those in the Civil War. Highly educated, very articulate, much more so than we tend to be today. And Abner kind of came out of that mold.
Yeah, that's a great answer to my question. I appreciate it. And, when you were young, some of the bunkhouse inhabitants on the ranch might have been born around the turn of the century. And so really a direct lineage to that. They're just a generation or so removed from the time when this took place.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. There's sense of humor. Some of the character development that happens throughout this book and fiction, there's sense of humor and perspectives on life that I try to portray in fiction. A lot of that comes from that same root source.
Mm-hmm. What about literary heroes of yours, or are there writers not only whom you not only admire but think, oh yeah, I like the way she does that. I like the way he does that. I want to do that. I want to emulate that.
When it comes to historical fiction, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, I have to think of books that I've read in more recent years in that genre. One is Peter Matheson's book, The Shadow Country, mm-hmm. which was introduced to me by Linda Miller, a friend of mine. Terrific writer. And I've read some of his nonfiction before. Mm-hmm. Oh man, you talk about dialogue and character development. That book deals with the protagonist is around 1900, 1910 in mm-hmm. Florida. Country kind of rogue, mm-hmm. but Jack Watson. He was terrific model for me. Another one, I think in a similar literary vein, is Donald McCaig, who had a book out, wrote a book called Jacob's Ladder, a novel of Virginia in the Civil War, mm-hmm. and reading a sequel now finally called Canaan. but he also has a gift for character development, dialogue, um, description, how to move a story. But people like that really got Cold Mountain, Charles Frazier, another one. He's just terrific.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
Oh, he's just terrific.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these guys are so good.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the template for me in terms of trying to use historical fiction as a literary form.
Mhm.
Paulette Giles, who I've read recently, she wrote the News of the World, The Color of Lightning about Comanches, and terrific, really a wonderful writer who's dealing with historical events in a very believable to me way.
Mhm.
That's really quite literary. Just a joy to read that stuff. So those would say that type of writing is aspirational for me. They're terrific models.
Yeah. Well, of the writers you mentioned, I'm familiar with. I think you're up there. This is like really terrific stuff.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you? I think I asked you this the other day when we were chatting, but finishing. I think I understand how much work this represents as much as I can understand. Is finishing it kind of bittersweet at all?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is. You get to know these characters. It's like Pete Fromm said at a presentation he gave here at Lewis and Clark Library some years ago. They talked about writing. So you can't wait to wake up in the morning and go downstairs and play with his imaginary friends.
Mhm.
So that's really kind of what you're doing here. But they become
a world that you have control.
Yeah, well, to some extent. I mean, really, the characters, we think we have control of the characters, but really, come to find out when you get into it, we really don't. I mean, they really kind of control their own destinies.
Mhm.
I mean, we
Once you set
can,
them in motion.
but excuse me.
Once you set them in motion.
Yeah, that's correct. If it's going to be organic, to use a word you used earlier, which is absolutely appropriate,
Mhm.
You have to let them be who they're going to be. What was I going with that? Yeah.
I asked if it were bittersweet, but
oh yeah.
But
So anyway, hate to give that up.
Yeah.
But in the same token, it can't go on forever.
right.
It's like raising a child, and at some point they got to leave home, and it's bittersweet. But it's absolutely the proper next stage in evolution of the relationship and of the individual.
So how are you going to deal with your empty nest syndrome?
The sequel.
Oh, okay. So tell us about that.
Oh, well, some of the characters will appear.
Uh-huh.
They're major drivers of the next book, but that continues with, I mentioned earlier, the Utah War, about 11 years later, late 1850s.
Mhm.
Again, it's just incredible winter march in this case across southern Wyoming by dragoons to get to Salt Lake, get to Utah,
Mhm.
to try to quell what was seen as a rebellion by the Latter-day Saints, form a republic of their own, and Washington didn't think that was a good idea at all, so they're going to put their foot down on it. But that gets into some other things too about some Utah history at the time. But it's equally fascinating.
Mhm.
And again, it's history that I didn't know. Not many people do know, and that people should know. So that's what I hope to do: make it available to a popular audience.
Good. Well, I hope.
Okay.
I'll be one of them.
Yeah.
Is there anything that I'm not asking you or haven't asked you that you want to talk about?
Not that I can think of. Clay. Nothing comes to mind.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's wrap it up.
Okay.
And really fun. I really enjoyed the book. Enjoyed talking with you about it, and highly recommend this book to whoever is watching us tonight.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.